We'll turn it over to Roger. Good report that you had in the backup. A lot of good information there, identifying a lot of areas that I know need improvement, and want to say great job to Commissioner Parker as well for leaning in and visiting neighborhoods and seeing whatever we can do to make that better. So go right ahead, Roger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and good morning to all our citizens who've come to listen to this presentation. Would like to give credit to my professional engineering staff, and want to note three individuals: Chris Phillips, my lab coordinator, a professional engineer; Mark Bonifay, a project engineer; and Ricky Sears, the county surveyor. They were able to readjust their workload and their schedule to be able to produce this presentation in a very short period of time. At the request of Commissioner Parker, the Board of County Commissioners directed the county engineer to review flooding complaints in the Pace P Ridge area of Santa Rosa County. We were directed to present recommendations to the board, and I have those at the end of this presentation. And while these recommendations do focus on the Pace P Ridge area, they are applicable to the entire county. And before we go through the actual presentation, we always have to have a brief history lesson. Santa Rosa County has required more stringent stormwater regulations for new developments since 1996. As many of you who have been here since the 90s know, in 95 we had two hurricanes, Aaron and Opal, which flooded many of our areas, particularly in the Florida town area. As a result of the federal disaster declaration from those two hurricanes, Santa Rosa County was awarded a hazard mitigation grant. Sheila Harris, our grants coordinator, is here and will perhaps present the issues behind hazard mitigation grant also at the end of the presentation. But Santa Rosa County has required a 100-year design storm since '96. Prior to that, from 1990 to '96, was only a 25, and prior to 1983, there were no adopted stormwater standards. So if you're living in a development that was planned, programmed in the 70s and 80s, it was probably designed with no retention, no method to attenuate a rainfall event of any magnitude, much less a large extreme that we've experienced this past June. June is the wettest June on record for the Santa Rosa County landfill. We went to an automated system 15 years ago, and with 28.25 inches of rainfall, it is the wettest June on record. So given the extreme event of July 6th, which I do understand flooded some of the homes in the Pace P Ridge area, any depression storage retention pond has been unable to recover because of persistent rainfall events up to and including the June 28th. The 5 projects that I've noted are all retrofit projects. Each of these projects have older development with no retention ponds. And one particular, the first one I'm going to lead off with, is the Florida town drainage area. FDOT and Santa Rosa County pursued stormwater mitigation projects to address that flooding for decades. And as I mentioned, we received a hazard mitigation grant project for the Florida town drainage project. And if I can get my map up. Dan, could you advance the slide, perhaps? Thank you. The Florida Town Drainage Project, well, now my pointer's not working. Florida Town Drainage Project, as many of you know, started at Emmanuel Baptist Church here and was a rock line ditch all the way down to Cotton Road. Cotton Road at the time, in early 2000s, was an open channel swale. And as a result, would overtop going into the Sheraton Barclay area, flooding homes, mixing with failing septic tanks to saturated soils, and creating many environmental concerns and issues. That was the nexus by which we were able to get the grant money. Cotton Road today has a 7-foot diameter culvert, and that red line you see along Cotton Road intermingling with, as it gets to Florida Town, passing under Florida Town, into a series of rock line ditches all the way to Escambia Bay. In conjunction with DOT, the fingers coming from Highway 90 going south in the blue, those were DOT ditches in which they participated in funding for the project. Specific recommendations that we have for the Florida Town drainage area are to look at alternatives to acquire additional properties for retention pond. There were 2 major ponds in the Florida Town drainage project, which includes the retention pond on Cotton Road. That's that bright, large blue area. And then the large blue area just south of Queens Court on Diamond Street. Okay. The Queens Court, Seaport, and North Island Road, each of those were included in the Florida Town Drainage Project. They were basically swell drainage reestablishing the natural flow across the grounds. But the specific recommendations we're recommending at this time is to look at additional property acquisition for retention ponds in the Sheridan-Barclay area with recovery. To go and purchase the property in this area of Santa Rosa County without having mechanical recovery or natural percolation, essentially the pond works the first rainfall event and then stays full of water. And the soils in this area of the PACE are not conducive to natural percolation. So then, as we go through doing our estimates, our construction estimates, we talk about mechanical recovery, i.e. stormwater lift stations. Some of the most expensive lift stations pumping stormwater to recover pond volume, but that's what's going to be required. Due to the timing of this presentation, we were unable to negotiate or talk to anyone about the property acquisition, but to say there are potential lots available in the Barclay, Sheridan area, and therefore we have no estimates at this time on the cost associated with that. The second project, which is a retrofit, next slide please, is the PACE drainage area. This is the Giddens Road, Norris Road, Tiburon East and West, PACE, Patriot, and the PACE Road, Fowler Road area. As you can see on the lines here, still no arrow, to the north is bounded by Adams Road. It's hard to believe, but water that falls on Adam Road west of West Spencerfield Road will actually discharge into Escambia Bay through this particular basin into the Florida Town drainage and onto Escambia Bay. And so it is that this project, if implemented, will strengthen and support protecting Florida Town drainage. Again, anyone that's been in the area for any period of time knows with these heavy rainfall events, Highway 90 will go under in the area of Emmanuel Baptist Church right there between Hardee's and the new Pep Boys. That highway goes under. When it goes underwater, now you're just river and flow. There's no control measures, nothing holding the water back, and that water inundates Florida Town to Cotton Road and tops Cotton Road, and then we know where it goes, Sheridan, Barclay, and on in that direction. So implementing this PACE drainage project will help the Florida Town area by cutting that water off and at least releasing and metering it through appropriate retention ponds. We're proposing a new retention pond in the area you see in the yellow there that says new on the screen. That wraps around the new PACE library just off of PACE Patriot. And as you know, PACE Patriot Boulevard has a fire station, sheriff's station, 2 schools, 1 on each end, a library, and then multiple subdivisions that utilize it at access. An engineering estimate to construct these stormwater improvements, which would include collection, conveyance, that large retention pond, and recovery, is estimated at $3.1 million. Next slide, please. The second area that we note is Metron Drainage Estates. This is a pre-1970s development starting at Kaiser Road on the west, Pennington to the north, and then ultimately Evelyn Street to the east and Highway 90 to the south. It's approximately 118 acres. It too was developed with no or minimal retention ponds. The only retention ponds are any of the newer developments on Highway 98 were required to put in stormwater, I said 98, Highway 90, were required to put stormwater retention as they developed. However, the residents on Cyril, Kaiser, and Pennington, sheet flow, shallow swells if swells at all running to the northwest as you see in the green arrows. Those green arrows hit School Lane, they pile up, run to the school until that ditch is overtopped, goes through the backyards, through numerous homes, going to what is now, you show there, yellow as in new. That is county-owned park-type property that was platted with Metron Estates. The proposal is to construct a new retention pond there. The purple arrows are new stormwater sewer, collection sewers with inlets to collect that water, convey it to the pond, and ultimately down the hill to the small retention pond in the northwest corner on Evelyn Street. There are several properties in the area that are probably candidates for acquisition, because looking at all the work that we did, there's just no way that from an engineering perspective you're going to adequately protect that first house north of that Evelyn Street retention pond. Again, an engineering estimate to construct those particular improvements is approximately $3.3 million, and it will require a stormwater pump station. Next slide, please. On a little bit better note, this is the Maranatha Chipper Lane. It is a hazard mitigation drainage project. It did qualify as a result of a declaration from the 2014 floods that Santa Rosa County experienced, and did receive a federal declaration. Property has been acquired. You see that blue cross-hatched area? That is a property that the county has acquired. We hired a consultant who worked through the preliminary engineering and ultimately on to this final design. We have not received state funding for construction, but it is in this basin area. It was targeted for a number of years, and hopefully this will be funded. That is approximately a $1.3 million total cost project. Next slide. This we're looking at is the Pace-Patterson Lane. This project has been funded by the state. It's a hazard mitigation grant project, approximately $1.5 million. It will involve the acquisition of those green parcels and lots that you see there. Unfortunately, this is a closed basin, and it is very, very difficult to dig a hole deep enough to get natural percolation, but the design of this project is to relieve the flooding on Pace Lane and those homes on Patterson, even perhaps some on Matthews. The existing retention ponds on Overlook and on Matthews do well right up until the point they fill up. And those ponds have not recovered. Well, the Overlook has recovered slightly, but many of those ponds never had a chance to recover during the June rain, and Pace Lane stood underwater for the most of the month of June. And so with that, the engineering department has specific recommendations to the board. They include reestablishing and maintaining existing stormwater swells, ditches, inlets, and outfalls. That's a catch-all, but basically what we're saying is doing these things is not going to protect you during a 100-year event, but they certainly will help. Every little bit helps so that when the big event comes, it can minimize the impact. It won't protect the areas we describe, but it certainly will help greatly. The other thing we look at is establishing natural drainage ways. The days of ditching and draining in Florida are over. No longer can we just take a backhoe and go through a swamp cutting ditches. However, through permitting agencies, there is handwork that can be done at inlets, bridges, culverts. We can maximize the flow through and under those structures, and so we're recommending specifically we look at those natural drainage ways to maintain the maximum flow through there. I'm going to go back to the original slide in a moment and talk through it, and then reestablish the natural stormwater pond capacities. Like I said earlier, ponds fill up, and then essentially that's it. There's no more capacity, so any runoff translates to flooding. And so we're going to be looking at retrofit on our existing ponds to see about what can be done to recover those volumes for stormwater storage. And then in each of these, we're recommending that we conduct mini basins, because often Stephen, I've heard him express to me, and this is Stephen Furman, our Public Works Director to my left, has said, we've wiped out that ditch 3 times and it's still a foot too deep. So conduct the mini basin studies to make sure that the actions that we're taking will be helpful, because we do want the most bang for your taxpayers' dollar, the most bang for the buck as we put our crews into the field. And then finally, conduct feasibility studies, identify properties for acquisition. That's a very important part, because absent stormwater property for stormwater ponds, we're really limited in what we can do as a county and as a department. We're recommending that we proceed with a feasibility design, funding alternatives, and then construction of those 5 stormwater retrofit projects that we discussed, and research funding alternatives. So with that, Commissioners, I'd turn it over to you for any questions you may have of me.
Thank you for the report, Roger. Turn it over to the District Commissioner if you have any comments. Commissioner Parker?
Thank you. You know, I think, and I know there's many people here probably prepared to speak. I feel like I've talked with many of you, or communicating, and I know there's a lot that I haven't. You know, as the newest commissioner, I definitely still have the most to learn out of all these men sitting up here, and I have a newfound respect that I've shared with them many times for the difficult decisions that they're forced to make when there's not always a right decision. However, you know, stormwater, just like roadway capacity, you know, every one of us that have lived here, you know, 20 plus years especially, have experienced far more congestion on our roadways, you know, because we haven't maintained that infrastructure to keep the current level that we were experiencing over the years as it grew. I know I'm the first to say that I'm not an engineer, and I know there's a big debate about on stormwater, depending on who you ask, have the folks building homes, you know, and I guess too, the second question is, when do you start? Do you say the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000, that folks building new homes are attributing to flooding of the older homes? But yet I talk with engineers who studied these things for many years in college, and who tend to say that with the new 100-year plan that went into effect in, I believe, 96, he stated that those areas, you know, capture their water. Anyway, needless to say, I kind of preface, I am prepared to make a motion from talking with, I'm sure there'll be much discussion. I'm just letting you know where I stand from talking with Mr. Blaylock. I think if you want to say bang for your buck as far as most homes affected, probably the idea of constructing the large project just north of the Tiburon neighborhood. Not only would that help the Tiburon area as well as those to the east of it on Fowler Drive and some of those side roads, but it was also help from my discussions with Mr. Blaylock, sort of attenuate that water before it got down to the Florida town area. A very, very important part that he discussed, especially for, say, that Florida town basin, you know, when we get into talking $3 million plus, is just like in his discussion that I would hope we allow staff to start examining the homes that have experienced repetitive flooding for, you know, basically a buyout option, which we have done in the past. Because for some of these folks, it's, you know, I know there's criticism when the county buys land and tears a house down, you know, whether they put a retention pond there or not. But when you talk $3 million, if we're only affecting a half dozen homes that are flooding, and we could say maybe, you know, buy those half dozen homes for under $1 million, and sometimes that is the most fiscally prudent thing. I know the money's got to come from somewhere, and this is a perfect time since we're in budget talks. I do know we have roughly $27 million that are unallocated. You know, we tend to call them the reserve fund, and they're there for, a large portion of them are necessary to maintain quality of life after a disaster reserve. They're also there, though, to help maintain not only the term maintain quality of life, but also protect our citizens. We have very proudly stepped up in the recent 8 months that I've been here and said we're going to work with the sheriff's office to give them what they need because we're concerned about people's safety. But I think many people also feel that their personal safety comes in the fact that they can go home and feel safe and secure in their own home. So what I'm going to urge the fellow board members to do is us make that a priority and commit to spending some funding. And also on another issue, I said in last Tuesday's budget meeting that I thought we needed to add more people to Public Works. Of course, we didn't have a crowd. We only had like 2 people here. But I feel it's the same way, especially you can see it in my district. I'm sure every district. I actually can point out many more spots in the Navarre area than I can in the Pace area that have suffered from basically right here, not maintaining the natural waterways. As Mr. Blaylock has said, it is not going to solve the problem in and of itself, but it could definitely help when you have these, rain over many period of times. That is not a knock to Public Works. They are operating with, less funding and personnel than they were 10 years ago. And at the end of the day, with the growth that we've seen, like I say, we have to maintain our infrastructure. I feel just as passionately about roadways as I do stormwater. And as far as just saying, when we grow, sometimes this is the cost of growth. But those are, I guess, my comments. I'll reserve for the other commissioners. I would definitely hope that we would at least move forward with allowing engineering to look at feasibility as far as identifying properties that would possibly be better for us to acquire rather than retrofit the area. But from talks with Mr. Blaylock, I do feel that we need to go ahead and make the commitment that we're going to move forward with the large project there north of the Tiburon neighborhood. And I'll just hit the points again from speaking with the homeowners in that area. We've got a fire department, police substation, fire department houses, EMTs, and we've got our public library there many people use. We've got an elementary school, a high school, and then hundreds of homes. And I know many people in those homes had expressed the thought of even folks outside of that area, whether it be folks in Metron Estates or Florida Town, you're going to depend in case of an emergency, on having those public services, those fire departments, or possibly to respond to an accident. And if they can't get out of their fire department or they have to take a 5-minute longer route, that could mean life or death for a cardiac patient or an infant because they can't get through the roadway because, several feet of water. So I hope, that is my hope, is that we can commit today to the public that we're going to move forward with that project. And I think that kind of sums up my comments for the moment.
Thank you, Commissioner Parker. Any other members of the board? Commissioner Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I concur with Commissioner Parker. A couple of things he said I want to add to. He said that the board hasn't maintained infrastructure over the years. The reason we haven't is because we haven't had the funding to do so. One of the best things that the citizens of this county did this past year was approve the half-cent sales tax for infrastructure and maintenance. Back in 2006, the board presented to the public a 10-year transportation plan for roads and maintenance and drainage. It failed by 600 votes. We would already be through that 10-year period putting that money to work to solve a lot of these problems. So my message is that the commissioners can only do what y'all allow us to do, and that's provide us with the funding necessary to take care and maintain the quality of life of this county. And this is the first year that we've had a dedicated source of revenue, half-cent sales tax, to go into infrastructure and drainage issues. And we're going to continue to rely on y'all in the future to help us figure out how to address these problems. But I wanted to say thank y'all for all the people who voted for that half-cent sales tax. It's not us. It's your quality of life that we're trying to fix. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Salter. There's another part of the presentation that was here that relates to hazard mitigation, and I didn't know before I make my comments if that was going to be addressed.
Sheila, were you going to address that now? We did want to, Mr. Chairman, as it relates to the, we thought it would be pertinent, and we'll go through there quickly, but we thought it would be educational to understand how the HMG program works, to show the evidence of it. And certainly Roger talked about the funding needed for various projects here, and that, as you know, most of our projects in the past have been and currently are HMGP projects, our large projects, Cotton Road, as he talked about, other projects that are ongoing. So it is important for everyone to understand kind of how those work, the timelines, and those issues. So if you bear with us, Sheila will brief us on status of HMGP and that process.
Yep, and before I go to Sheila, I did want to say that Roger brought up a valid point, and that is that the recommendations and what we're seeing in the Pace P Ridge community also apply to areas throughout the county. So I realize that we have folks here from Milton and East Milton, and we have folks here from South County. This does apply, and some the things that are being talked about right now definitely apply across the county. And Commissioner Parker, I want to get back to your recommendation and continue that discussion once we hear from Sheila on the HMGP stuff. Good morning.
Morning, thank you. I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. A few of the things that I'm going to talk about is just to give the public and a refresher to you guys about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Just briefly touch on the 5 projects that are currently underway that are funded with HMGP. A little bit of a history lesson on the projects that we have completed in the last 10 or so years, and then talk a little bit about what's known as the local mitigation strategy, and briefly touch on some other mitigation funding opportunities and projects that are underway. So if you'll go to the slide that has information about the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is funding that is allocated after a designated disaster, and the funding is intended to assist counties that are impacted by the disaster to implement mitigation projects. Next slide. It is a federal program, 75% grant funds. The local community must fund the remaining 25%. FEMA is the final approval party in that. It is limited to communities, and so therefore the local governments have to make those tough decisions about which projects are going to provide the most results for the community. The program itself has many requirements for a project to be funded, and you can see those listed there. The 3 that are highlighted are particularly challenging at times. That first one, which is to demonstrate that a project is cost effective, similar to the comment that Commissioner Parker made regarding, do you spend $3 million on a large scale drainage project when you could purchase, those houses for less than $1 million. So those are the types of things that can be sometimes difficult to demonstrate. The next slide shows the types of eligible activities. Historically in Santa Rosa County, we have chosen to apply those funds toward drainage projects. However, we have also completed several wind retrofits individually the county, as well as in partnership with Rebuild Northwest Florida, and over 3,000 homes in Santa Rosa County have been hardened since Hurricane Ivan with HMGP funding. And we were also able to put shutters on many of the county buildings, as well as elevating the lift stations on Navarre Beach with some of those past HMGP grants. So our major drainage projects within the past 10 years, which do not include the Florida Town project, which was is about 20 years old, you can see those listed there. And so we have been able to secure 6.7 in grant funds, for which the county has added another getting old, I can't see that, 1.8 million to, and those have received, I think, have been met with appreciation from those residents in those areas who no longer or maybe do not experience the issues that they did previous to the projects. The next slide is just some history timelines for those projects, and as you can see, it could take up to 10 years in some cases for these funds to be secured and expended. And the last 4 or the last 5 listed there, I don't have timelines for yet because we don't know when the construction money is going to be approved. But in general, I would say that we are looking on average to about 4 to 5 years post-disaster for these projects to be completed moving forward. There are 5 open drainage projects, next slide, one of which was funded as a result of the Tropical Storm Debbie in 2012. The other 4 funded as a result of the April 14 flooding. And 2 of those projects, the Maranatha Way and Chipper Lane and Pace Lane and Patterson Lane, are in the Pace area. And that 4th project listed there, Pace Lane and Patterson Lane, there is agenda items today regarding the construction funding approval of that. So that's exciting that we will be able to move forward with construction of that project before the end of the year. We do have one outstanding hazard mitigation grant program application, and that is to acquire a repetitively flooded property in Navarre. The next slide shows some funding. If you add up all of the projects that are currently underway, you can see that the county will be securing approximately $10 million in federal funds, and will be contributing $3.3 from the local option sales tax to implement those projects. Another one of our funding sources that we go after is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. And those are to benefit repetitively flooded properties that have made claims through the National Flood Insurance Program. It is competitive. The federal share of the grant can range from 75% up to 100%, but the homeowners are expected to meet any local match. The county's focus historically has been to elevate those properties as opposed to acquire or other mitigation. And since 2010, we have either elevated or acquired 12 properties, and we have another 4 that we are currently working on. The next slide indicates the classification of those repetitively flooded properties. They are either designated as a severe repetitive loss with the criteria shown there, or a repetitive loss. And we do get a lot of calls from property owners who have been flooded. It is, however, difficult to get approval for these grants unless you have the history of the flood insurance claims, and they also at times need to be significant dollars and not smaller claims. The current project you could see listed there includes those 4 homes, and we do expect to complete those within the next 6 to 9 months, and we do have one outstanding application for another property in the south end. We have the next slide just as a recap of the completed flood mitigation assistance projects, noting that we have been able to secure $2.5 million, and the homeowners have contributed about $200,000 to those properties. The next slide, I really won't go into that. If Stephen has any comments, he can make them, but those are just some of the ongoing activities that our Public Works Department does as they can fit them into their program of work. We also secure community development block grant program funds from time to time. The current project that we have is a sewer project, and that will be in the Pace area, and we expect that construction to be in next year. You can only have one CDBG project open at a time. There are always more grant applications than there are funding, and so the county has to be strategic in terms of the project that we put forward. Stormwater drainage is an eligible activity for funding, and certainly when the county looks at the next opportunity, we will look at the list of needs in terms of drainage and stormwater to determine if that's a good application for submittal. There are a few mitigation-related activities going on in Holly by the Sea. I won't go into those other than to say that the Sunrise Drive is currently under design, could see construction next year, and then I believe the drainage ditch master plan will be coming to the board at the next meeting. Another project is the Holly by the Sea Camden Drive drainage project, and again, I believe that one would be funded in next year, or excuse me, constructed next year. Local mitigation strategy is a task force, for lack of better words, that meets typically on a quarterly basis to discuss mitigation needs in our county, and their primary purpose is to maintain and update what's known as the LMS plan. They identify risks, develop mitigation priorities, prioritize those priorities, and then work to identify funding. The county's current plan was approved last year, is good for 5 years, and the main component of that plan, which is typically of interest to the public, is what's referred to as the mitigation project listing, and that is intended to be a listing of mitigation needs. It's not directly tied to funding, but it is a tool for which the local mitigation strategy can use, as well as the commissioners in their decision-making process. And we are currently working to add some of these projects that you heard about today to the list, get them prioritized. The next meeting of the local mitigation strategy, if anyone is interested, is this Thursday, the 27th at 1:30 p.m. in the Public Services Media Room. Moving forward, you can see that absent a new disaster, these funds will be depleted after completion of the current projects. We will be eligible to apply for funding after another disaster, whether we are impacted or not. However, if we do apply for funding for a disaster that did not impact us, we basically get the lowest priority for that funding, and it can take years for that, what's known as the tier process, to come through. There are no other substantial grant opportunities that we know of at this time to continue stormwater drainage improvements, but we do continue to look into that and take planning efforts that will allow us to apply for additional grant funding. And then we'll continue to identify the different homeowners that might be eligible for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program to assist with acquisitions or elevations. Is there any questions about the information that I presented?
Yeah, I know that's a lot. The one question that I have is, if I was sitting in the audience and I was listening to this, or if I'm in the Navarre community, there's going to be an obvious omission as it relates to this one particular funding source, and that is the number of projects in the District 4 area. We basically have the one on Orion Lake that's 700,000, somewhere in that neighborhood, that was done in 2011. And other than that, we don't have anything else really on the list as it relates to mitigation. Could you speak to a little bit why that is? It's not that there is some slight in the way this funding is allocated per se. It's just there's certain characteristics related to this funding, and I wondered if you could just maybe speak to that to educate those that may be watching on why District 4 is nowhere really in this funding source.
Okay, so I think your question was of the previously completed hazard mitigation grant program projects, why Navarre area only had one, correct?
We could just say moving forward. We know from looking at the backup, we've only had one that's listed on there. So why moving forward do we not have any mitigation funded projects?
Well, again, as we mentioned earlier, the funds are limited for the hazard mitigation grant program, and after a disaster, a county typically knows how much of the allocation will be made available to them. And so in looking at our project options, the local mitigation strategy evaluates different projects for funding, and those that are prioritized, meaning they have the most homes that had water in them or the largest dollar amount of damage, those projects are going to rise to the top. And the local mitigation strategy then recommends those projects to the commissioners who evaluate them and then approve them for submittal. And so I would venture to say that although we certainly know that there are issues within the Navarre community, that the projects that have been funded in other parts of the county either had more homes that had water within them in a more concentrated area potentially, and that's why they advanced. However, moving forward, we will certainly work to ensure that projects in the Navarre area are identified and added to the list and prioritized as appropriate. In fact, one of my staff members met last week with the Holly by the Sea board to talk about how to get specific projects nominated and on the list, and so we're already working on that. Anyone can nominate a project. However, we typically rely on our engineering and public works department to provide specific projects for which mitigation could positively impact that area.
All right, thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the board?
Mr. Chairman, if I could add just to kind of shorten up what Sheila said on that last one there, I think at the end of the day, when FEMA evaluates these applications, the cost-benefit analysis is going to really be the driving factor, and the number of homes that are flooded have really when you look at the historical perspective of these projects, the number of homes flooded in these general areas has been the thing that brought the cost-benefit analysis to that level that FEMA awarded them.
Thank you. A few comments that I have regarding this, and they piggyback a little bit off of what Commissioner Parker said earlier. Yes, public safety, number one. That should be the number one charge of what we do, is providing for the public safety. But right now, if staff needs clear policy direction from this single commissioner, infrastructure is number two for me. The fact that we have to have an HOA meet with staff to look at projects, if that's because I have not been communicating clearly enough how important infrastructure is for me in District 4, I'm communicating now publicly in front of God and everybody that I feel that what we're doing is not meeting the expectations of the public in the area where we live. And I have put forward recommendations. I have sat back and waited, and I'm looking for specifics and action items ahead of the August 7th and August 10 meeting when we're in South County, where we can have things on the table that show us this is what we're doing now, this is where we need to be, and here are the specific action items that we're going to do to take us from where we are to where we need to be. Because HMGP is one funding source. It's only one funding source, but it just doesn't happen fast enough. It doesn't happen soon enough. And I realize that we haven't had a dedicated funding source like we do now with the local option sales tax, to where maybe we can address some of these issues. but I think it also comes down to how we're allocating our resources in our budget. And we have to look at if the community is clearly telling us that infrastructure is an issue, and I think you only need to drive around after these 100-year flood events that seem to happen more and more frequently now, that this is obviously an area of importance. And I have recommended that we look at land development code and ordinance related changes that can help with maybe tapping the brakes on development as well as helping out with enforcement. Operational and maintenance improvements, which is why I recommended the stormwater drainage maintenance plan to where we can identify what stormwater drainage easements we own, which ones, what's the cost going to be of us to maintain them, and let's have a plan moving forward to improve that portion of stormwater drainage. And then the capital piece. Instead of picking a capital project based on what the emergency is of the day, let's have more of a structured effort based on our staff's leadership and knowledge of boots on the ground of where do we need to put dollars to work now. Because I know that staff's in a very difficult position, but when I look at the recommendations basically say, do more of the same. We need to have the ditches cleaned out, we need to work on that, and we need to have some more studies. I think if this board tells the public that we're going to have another study of stormwater drainage, it's not going to go well. I don't think we need any more studies as much as we need to identify areas where money needs to be put to work, and then we need to look at, I would recommend today that we direct staff to put out an RFP to update the impact fee study. We can't enact impact fees again to help with any capacity improvements, to help with any funding, unless we have the study. And so that's a step that whether or not we bring back impact fees or not, we know we have to make. So instead of dragging our feet on that, that's one recommendation I would put out there. Let's go ahead and have the study updated to where if we wanted to bring back impact fees, we could. Let's look at stormwater drainage fees in certain areas where we can have development start paying for itself. And I don't want to disproportionately impact the Home Builders Association or builders or realtors. I think we're all in this boat together. But we've got to find a way to identify funding sources to where we can start making improvements. So that's what I would like to see as a policymaker, is directing our staff to reallocate resources as needed and to identify funding sources that we can take the steps to get those funding sources in place, or at least have the conversation at this board level. And then if there isn't two other people that agree with me on impact fees or on stormwater drainage maintenance fees, then we'll, at least the public will know when they go to the ballot box who made decisions on certain policy decisions and how they decided. For me, what we're doing now has been a product of the lack of resources that we've had and staff doing the best job they can with the limited resources they have. And I think it's our responsibility to give them clear policy direction